Oh God, are you putting me in the Pinto?
You're driving the Pinto, man.
Henry Ford may have once believed that the only car anyone in the world needed was the Model T. But since then, the Ford Motor Company has definitely veered from the mainstream many times in their history. From bizarre special editions to entire brands, here are my picks for the top 10 weirdest cars from Ford.
Oh! Oh! Oh!
Thanks to the success of my last Top 10 Weirdest Cars episode featuring General Motors, it was a no-brainer to have the next Top 10 feature another of Detroit's original Big Three, Ford. Ford has the distinction of 2 entire brands that qualify for this list, plus a few oddball cars that I didn't even realize existed until I started researching this episode. Be sure to offer your suggestions for cars I may have missed, that I could include in a future episode.
Is that German for bad marketing concept? No.
And like the video I did on weird GM cars, I am venturing out of my usual 80s to mid-2000s timeline to include some older Ford models. Number 10. Ford Bigfoot Cruiser. When you consider that Ford's F-Series pickups have been among the top-selling vehicles of all time, having one of them included on a list of weird cars may itself sound weird, until you consider this particular special edition. A special edition that very few have ever even seen, least of all ever owned. Although monster trucks are a billion-dollar business today, back in the early 80s, seeing a pickup truck with wheels big enough to drive over and crush cars was far from a common sight. But that all changed in 1981, when Bob Chandler, who had spent the previous several years modifying his Ford F-250 pickup, was able to do just that. His truck even made it into a starring role in the movie Take This Job and Shove It, later that same year. Ford wanted to capitalize on all the publicity that Bigfoot was getting by offering their own version of Bigfoot that could be sold to the public. Of course, Ford's special edition, called the Bigfoot Cruiser, which was first sold in 1987, wouldn't have wheels anywhere near as big, nor could it ride anywhere near as high off the ground as the original Bigfoot. Contracted out to Shearer Truck Equipment, who made all the modifications, the package was offered not just on the F-250, but was also available on the F-150 and even the Ford Ranger. The F-Series models had 33-inch tires with several inches of suspension lift, whereas the Ranger only really benefited from having slightly larger wheels than stock. All 3 models were painted the same blue as the original, along with in-your-face Bigfoot decals. Unfortunately, these modifications, which also included a front winch and KC lighting above the cab, had never been crash tested under NHTSA standards, and the large tires didn't have proper clearance in the wheel wells and were rubbing against the brake lines, forcing Ford to issue a recall on the approximately 1,000 Bigfoot Cruiser models built up to that point. Those that were fixed under recall lost their larger wheels, lift kit, and the extra add-ons, losing any increased value the special edition would have given them. Ford even bought back several of the trucks and stripped off the mods to avoid any potential liability. Today, finding a Bigfoot Cruiser in its original pre-recall state is extremely rare, making it one of the rarest special editions Ford has ever made. Number 9. Lincoln Blackwood. If you saw my first flops video, this truck should look familiar, but the fact that it was Lincoln's first pickup, as well as being a spectacular flop, doesn't alone make it a weird car. In fact, if the same truck were released today, it may have a better chance of selling well, as the idea of a luxury pickup is far from unusual today, and in fact is commonplace. When the Blackwood concept was first revealed in 1999, the reaction was initially very positive, as Lincoln had recently released the hugely popular Navigator SUV, so offering a luxury pickup wasn't a huge stretch. The 2002 Blackwood was essentially a rebadged Ford F-150 pickup, but in order to maintain the Lincoln family resemblance, and likely to save on production cost, the Blackwood's front end was lifted directly from the Navigator, and its interior essentially was a Navigator as well, which in turn was an F-150 interior, but with black wood trim, although sadly that wood wasn't even real. No rear bench seat was available, instead only available with 2 separate rear seats, limiting the Blackwood to being a 4-passenger vehicle, and it was only available in rear-wheel drive. But the most notable feature for the Blackwood is what put it on this list.
Though the trickiest piece of all is the solid, power-operated but non-removable tonneau cover. It covers a carpeted and stainless steel lined 56.3-inch long cargo space that's accessed not by a tailgate but by Dutch doors.
Made the bed essentially a large trunk, and not suitable for hauling anything that a typical pickup could do. Although Lincoln had estimated sales of 18,000 per year, the Blackwood was discontinued just 15 months later, after only 3,356 were ever made, making it the shortest production run for any Ford vehicle before or since.
Louder, louder, softer, softer.
Number 8. Ford Pinto Cruising Wagon. So unlike the last special edition vehicle that was on this list, which was meant to complement an already best-selling vehicle, the Cruising Wagon was one of several special editions that graced the lowly Pinto. with this one being only available in the Pinto's final 3 years. Yes, the Pinto maybe could have made this list simply because of its propensity to catch fire. But most Pintos weren't all that unusual during their final years, despite being Ford's first subcompact offering for the North American market at its debut in 1971.
I've always loved you.
With the Pinto's replacement, the North American version of the Ford Escort, in development, Ford tried to squeeze out some more sales for the Pinto's final years by offering several special editions, which were all appearance packages, as the attempt was to make them look more sporty, not actually be more sporty. The package that did the best at screaming out which decade it was made was the Cruising Wagon, first introduced in 1977. The Cruising Wagon was intended to be a companion to the larger Cruising Van, and shared the full-size van's incredibly tasteful disco stripes and opera windows. For 1980, Ford took their Rally package, once available only on the hatchback, and offered it on the wagon to become the Rally Cruising Wagon, and it lost the groovy stripes. However, with the Pinto being in its last model year, Ford simplified the engine choice to only the 2.3-liter 4, dropping the V6 option, making the Rally name even less applicable. The Pinto Shaggin' Wagon was relatively rare even back when it was new, so does that make any survivors more valuable today? Well, it's a Pinto, so no.
Yeah, baby, yeah!
Number 7. The final generation of the Ford Thunderbird. Here's another car that made it into one of my 2 sales flops videos, but it also qualifies here, as it was an example of Ford jumping on the retro bandwagon, which usually means the car may look a bit weird compared to other modern cars. But unlike their 5th generation retro-styled Mustang that arrived a few years later, which did a good job at modernizing the classic pony car design, the 11th generation Thunderbird simply looked like a car that only our grandparents would recognize. Sharing nothing with the last Thunderbird that ended in 1997, the 2002 Thunderbird was based on a platform shared with then subsidiary Jaguar for their S-Type and XF models. The same platform also underpinned the new Lincoln LS, Lincoln's first small sports sedan, and even the dashboard of the Thunderbird was taken from the LS, making the inside completely mismatched from the retro-inspired exterior. Just like the original from 1955, this new T-Bird also offered a removable hardtop, and could even be ordered with a rolling stand to store the stop in your garage. Ford tried to win over more buyers by offering a James Bond-themed edition for the movie Die Another Day in 2003, which didn't help considering the movie was, at least as Bond movies go, a relative flop. Today, the last-gen T-Bird typically only sells to older buyers, which was primarily all the buyers it had when new, as its retro exterior was really only appreciated by those who appreciated the original.
If you ever wanna get away from California.
Number 6. Ford EXP and Mercury LN7. So what made this car weird? Well, just look at the front end. These were the days before composite headlamps became standard on all cars, meaning that every car's headlamps pretty much looked the same. So as to make their new 2-seater hatchback have its own unique look, Ford designers thought somehow that Frog Eyes would look good. Introduced in 1982, the headlamp design wasn't the only weird thing about the EXP. Based on the North American Ford Escort platform, the EXP was the same size as a 2-door Escort, but was missing its back seat. Ford's thinking was that the EXP would be for young 1980 singles who wanted a cheap, economical sports car, but from the outside, it didn't really look like a 2-seater. As was very common back then, Ford offered the same car to Mercury and called it the LN7, which had about as much meaning as EXP did, which is nothing. The LN7 sold far less than the EXP, as the 2-seater really didn't fit in the Mercury brand, and was discontinued 2 years later.
LN7. Now more than ever, the world belongs to Lincoln Mercury.
Ford revamped the EXP in 1985 to look more like the Escort, so much so that it even changed the name to Escort EXP, and it didn't look so weird as before. But it still didn't really look like a 2-seater sports car, and mid-engine 2-seaters were becoming more popular, stealing away potential sales.
A new form of 2-seat excitement.
It also didn't help that insurance companies would typically charge more for 2-seaters, making the EXP less desirable to the younger buyers it was originally intended to attract. The EXP was history by 1989, and nearly all have disappeared from our roads today. Number 5. Merkur. I included this obscure brand from Ford primarily for one reason, the name, at least in regards to how it was perceived by North American car buyers. Certain European models have always been considered higher luxury than American or Japanese brands in the eyes of many American buyers, and was especially true in the 1980s, with models from BMW and Mercedes in particular vying for the top spot.
I'm sorry I can't put the top up. I haven't figured out how to do it yet.
Since Ford already had a significant presence in Europe, it seemed like a no-brainer to try importing some of their European models to North America. However, Ford exec Bob Lutz, who then was CEO of Ford of Europe and previously worked for BMW, believed if they sold these models under their Mercury or Lincoln brands, it may not be as obvious to consumers that they were European imports. So instead, Ford introduced a new brand, or mark as it would be called in Europe, and called it Merkur. That name may have been fine in Germany, but in America it was rarely pronounced correctly, and instead was usually known as
Merkur. Initially, just one model was available under the Merkur name, the XR4 Ti, a hatchback coupe that was known as the Ford Sierra XR4i in Europe. But the Sierra name couldn't work in North America, thanks to the similar Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra name. Plus, the Sierra was a trim level for GMC pickups back in 1985. The T in XR4 Ti was added to the Merkur version to emphasize the four-cylinder was turbocharged. And looks-wise, well, that was a bit weird too, at least in the eyes of North American buyers, thanks to the double spoiler.
And we'll give you a matched set of luggage with any car you buy or lease, or the sensational tote bag just for taking a test drive.
Ford also decided to only import the coupe, despite a four-door sedan being available for the Sierra in Europe. Despite a later removal of one of the two spoilers, and the addition of a second model, the four-door Scorpio, having them sold at Lincoln Mercury dealerships meant that they competed against similar-looking cars, like the Mercury Sable, that cost far less. With so much mispronunciation of the Merkur name, Ford stopped marketing the XR4 Ti and Scorpio with the Merkur name by 1989, and the Merkur models started to disappear from Lincoln Mercury dealerships the following year. Having been the second new brand that was a complete failure for Ford, the first being the Edsel, Ford never again tried to introduce a new brand to the North American market. Number 4. Mercury Breezeway. So here is one that is not a specific model, but instead a trim feature that spanned multiple models. The Breezeway was a retractable rear window, which to younger viewers may seem like an unnecessary option, since today virtually every car on the market comes standard with air conditioning. But back in the 1950s, AC was expensive, and only available on the costliest models. The idea of a retractable rear window by itself is now what made these cars so weird. It was also the angle of the rear window, which was effectively parallel to the windshield. And it was also one of the rare examples where Mercury could better differentiate themselves from the Ford branded models they shared. The feature was initially called Breezeway Ventilation, and was first offered on the 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser, although the angle of the glass itself was more traditional, but with an extended roof, which I suspect wasn't just for style, but maybe also to help the air circle back in towards the window. This one wasn't a big seller due to the added cost, so Ford tried it again with the Lincoln Continental in 1958 and 59, this time slanting the glass rearward. But by 1962, Mercury was having a difficult time convincing the public to spend more on their models that looked nearly identical to their Ford-branded counterparts. So for 1963, Mercury differentiated their Mercury Monterey from the Ford Galaxy by extending the roof out over the rear slanted retractable glass. There was also an extra vent control on the dash to help pull the air through. The same feature was offered on the Mercury Montclair and Park Lane models. Mercury kept a more traditional roof for their Marauder line. Although Mercury sold over 92,000 Breezeway models for 1963, by 1965, sales dropped by half, thanks to some owners complaining that the car's exhaust fumes often made their way into the cabin. It also didn't help that the buying public quickly grew tired of the polarizing reverse slant look, so for their next redesign in 1967, they had a more conventional roofline. However, the 67 and 68 models still offered retractable glass, but it could only retract a couple inches. Although air conditioning still wasn't a cheap option, it was becoming more popular, enough that by 1969, it killed off the Breezeway for good.
The elegant new Mercury Monterey for 1963.
Number 3.
The Probe from Ford. Have you ever priced one? They're very easy to get into.
This is another example of a car whose name helped it make it onto this list. Admittedly, when this car first arrived on the streets in 1988, I thought it looked cool. It was such an improvement over the blocky square cars of the early 80s, and as a result, it had a futuristic vibe. So much so that it wasn't hard to spot thinly disguised models in Back to the Future Part 2.
Don't drive train, Lorenzo!
And I will also admit, at the time, I didn't think the name was all that bad. Maybe Ford execs thought the buying public would associate it with futuristic space probes, which I probably did myself back then. But now, all I can think of is something like this.
Yo, nuts! It's probing time.
Ford had already used the name Probe on several concept cars prior to considering it for a production model. But the name Probe wasn't what the car was originally going to be called. Ford had to quickly come up with this new name thanks to huge public backlash to their first choice, Mustang. Yes, the car that we know as a Probe was supposed to be the 4th generation Mustang. Not only that, but it was designed by Ford's subsidiary Mazda, sharing a platform with their MX-6, along with front-wheel drive and no option for a V8 engine. Ford was considering having the third-gen Fox body Mustang be renamed Mustang Classic and phased out over the next couple years, with a new Mazda-designed Mustang to take its place. The idea was leaked to Autoweek magazine in 1987, and the outcry was so bad that Ford relented, keeping the Fox body Mustang for a few more years, and introduced the Probe to be sold alongside. The first-gen Probe managed to sell well enough to earn a second generation for 1993, although this time around Ford had much more input in its design. Ford even tried exporting the second gen to Great Britain, although dropped it there 3 years later due to poor sales. Sport coupe sales were a tough sell in the mid-90s, and Ford seemed more interested in promoting the more aerodynamic 4th gen Mustang, leading to the end of the Probe by 1997. And thankfully, no more Probe jokes.
The Probe.
Number 2.
You bought an Edsel.
Just like my weird GM Cars episode, when I stated that some of the cars in the list were there simply because they were ugly, well, this one definitely qualifies.
This is the Edsel.
Initially intended to fall somewhere between Mercury and Lincoln in terms of pricing and luxury status, the Edsel was named after Henry Ford's only child, who had passed away in 1943, despite objections from Edsel's son, Henry Ford II. At its first public unveiling on September 4, 1957, Ford heavily promoted the new car line as cars of the future and bragged about the superior product development and research in the car's design.
How does it feel to own an Edsel?
It's like falling in love.
They even created an entire TV show for the car, named, not surprisingly, The Edsel Show.
The car that presents originality and elegance.
For its inaugural year of 1958, across a nationwide network of 1,187 dealers, the Edsel offered 7 different models: the Ranger, Pacer, Corsair, Citation, Roundup, Villager, and Bermuda. The Edsels offered futuristic features for the time, such as aircraft-inspired gauges.
Like this speedometer that glows red when you exceed the safe maximum speed you set it for.
And shift buttons on the steering wheel. But all the new gadgets were for naught, as almost no one could get past the vertical front grille, commonly referred to as the horse collar grille. And it also became clear that much of the underlying design really wasn't any different than cheaper Ford-branded models. Sales were decent, but below original expectations, which in hindsight is not at all surprising.
But now, you don't have to worry about traffic.
The 1959 models were redesigned in response to the overwhelmingly negative front-end design, although the horse collar grille remained. Ford also had to drop the pricing, which moved the Edsel below Mercury in the brand lineup, and dropped 4 of the 7 initial models.
What do you have to remember? Sell the car every June and December. Sell the car.
With sales still dropping, 1960 Edsels finally abandoned the horse collar grille entirely, which ironically meant the Edsel lost all of its original identity. Finding a 1960 Edsel is tough, considering only 2,846 were produced for that model year, and production ended in November of 1959. Ford took a loss of over $250 million back then, equivalent to nearly $2.5 billion today. Most Edsels plummeted in value and were left for the junk heap. However, unlike the Pinto, some restored Edsels can now command 6-figure price tags due to their rarity. Although I'm sorry to say that when I see one today, I can't help but laugh. Number 1. The third generation of the Ford Taurus. I picked this one as number 1, not just because it was, in my opinion, goofy looking, but because of the risks Ford took with what was one of their best-selling cars in its history up to that point. The Ford Taurus, which replaced the short-lived mid-size version of the LTD in 1986, was a significant departure from the typical square style of the early 80s, with more rounded corners that improved aerodynamics. It was so futuristic looking for the time that it even had a starring role in the first RoboCop movie in 1987.
Your move, creep.
Although some referred to the first-gen Taurus as a jelly bean car, it was such a sales hit that the second-gen in 1992 was very similar in design to ensure not to scare off dedicated customers. But by 1996, Ford competitors such as Chrysler were introducing even more rounded shapes in their sedans. Considering the Ford logo itself was an oval, the third-gen Taurus paid homage to the logo by making nearly everything on the car be an oval. The headlamps, front grille, door handles, entire rear window, and even the dashboard pod containing the radio and climate controls were all ovals. The latter made aftermarket radio upgrades much more challenging. Even more oval windows were in the wagon version. The twin Mercury Sable was similar, but toned down the ovals a bit, with at least a square rear window on the sedan. The Taurus had been the best-selling car in North America since its debut, and although it kept that title for 1996, half of the sales went to rental fleets, and in 97, the Taurus for the first time lost the top spot to the Toyota Camry.
Making the dream come true.
Losing the top spot to Toyota, along with a continued mockery of what was now really a jelly bean car, Ford quickly began development for a redesign that debuted only 4 years later, which although retained an aerodynamic shape, toned down the use of so many ovals.
Well, they say geniuses pick green. But you didn't pick it.
Despite the changes, the Taurus never regained the top spot from either the Honda Accord, Toyota Camry, or even the Nissan Altima. Although Ford officially discontinued the Taurus in 2005 and replaced it with the bigger and far less daring 500, Ford would later bring the Taurus name back. But with the market now shifting to trucks and SUVs, the Taurus would never come close to the sensation it once was. And I think it is safe to say the weird Jelly Bean 3rd Gen model marked the beginning of the end. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.
Quick, hang a right.